if you do need a drink and I'm talking, I won't at all be offended if you get up, mosey on over, grab a beer and come back. Just want to run through a couple of things just based on what was already said tonight. First of all, I'd like to thank the 20% of people that left in the last 3 minutes. It's going to improve my NPS. Second thing is, last time I was here was a couple of years ago at this meetup in this very spot, and I kind of wandered all over the place. When I watched the video later, I was off camera for half of it, which was funny. The other thing is I was told I had 15 minutes and I took 40. So just bracing you, managing expectations low to start with so that later your experience is better. It's going to affect my NPS. I actually did a couple of NPS projects when I was working at Telstra a few years ago, and it was like you're on a team and there's a bunch of people doing stuff, and it's like you're on a train wreck and you can see it coming, and you can only do, you're on a train that's going to whack into something really big and ugly, but you're on a train, right? It's not like you can turn left, right? And that was my experience working on NPS programs at a large telco who shall remain nameless, I think. I also want to kind of pay tribute to Teresa and Daniel, like two great speakers, yeah? Yeah? So if you want to maintain a high standard, there's the door. It is time to leave. Because I'm going to talk about the rater thing and explain what it is in a minute. But you mentioned BDD, right, which is beer-driven. Beer-driven. All right, cool. So that's my random preamble. Are we happy with that so far? Because that's the tone of what you're about to get for the next 15, 20 minutes. Right? Yeah? No? It's okay so far? Good. All right. So I've been public speaking for almost 18 years, I realised the other day. So my public speaking career is almost ready to vote. You'd think I'd be good by now. I feel relaxed on stage, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a good 15 minutes. And I'm watching Rick at the front. He's just going, what the fuck? That's all right. We'll get to it, right? So what I thought I'd do is before Net Promoter Score is everywhere these days, right? And it really took hold somewhere in the last 10, 12 years or something, and it's just everywhere, right? But this rater model that I'm going to tell you about was actually, even though people didn't call it rater, because that's the kind of the academic world version of what I'm going to talk about, it was actually the core of thinking around quality in service industries. So consultancies, call centres, even real estate agents and pharmaceutical companies all had this built into the way that they operated. And I'll explain where it came from tonight. And then I'm going to kind of get into the details of what it is so you understand what it is. You're going to be looking at it and you're going to be going, this is the future. This is actually where things need to go. I'm going to challenge the model a bit and explain why it's got flaws and why it's not perfect. And then at the end of the day, I'm going to ask you to do some things and go, so what, right? So interspersed in that, you're going to talk to each other. Now, this story begins in 1990. Who here was alive in 1990? Approximately half the room. Nice. So here's some funny things that happened in 1990. Have a look at that bunch of pictures, right? This is just to set the context, because we've just been talking about the very shiny, brand new Net Promoter Score, which was framed in Harvard Business Review, which is usually about 5 years after it really arrived in 2003, right? But in 1990, the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, Margaret Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister of England. George Bush led the campaign into the Middle East with Desert Storm. The next one is, it was the very first trans-Antarctic crossing with sled dogs. I thought you'd need to know that. You knew that already, didn't you?
Yeah, me too.
Bob Hawke won his election in Australia. He was Prime Minister. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, Mikhail Gorbachev was first President of Russia after Soviet days. Driving Miss Daisy won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. The Hubble was launched. Do you know who the next guy is? Tim Berners-Lee. Is that right? Yeah. And what happened in 1990 that's related to him? It was in December of 1990. The World Wide Web was created. Yeah? And then the last one, why is the last one? Because it makes it a kind of a penultimate thing. Nelson Mandela escaped 30 years of prison in South Africa. Right? Played by Morgan Freeman, probably. So, so the first thing I want to do before I get into the details of this is just a little activity I run with people. The picture is an example. What I want you to do, if you had pen and paper, I get you to draw it. If we had a different room, I get you to talk to the person next to you, but just sit there in your head, right? And what I want you to do is I want you to think about the work you do and the value stream of that work out to a real customer, right? So you're a part of a team. What does that team expect from you? That team is a part of a value stream. Maybe there's like testers at the other end doing UAT. That's a thing still, isn't it? We heard that earlier tonight. Yeah. Well, 1990, right? And what happens after that, right? Maybe there's a marketing team that kind of launch it to the world. Maybe there's prototype or early customers. Maybe there's the real market after that, right? So just think for a second about like that stream and what everyone's expecting from the step in that journey before them, right? Now bring it locally to you, right? What's your team delivering to? What's the next step in that value chain? And what are they expecting and what are you doing? Does it match or is there a gap? Just reflect on that at the moment and think through that value stream as, is there a gap at any point in that process? Is there a gap between the team and you, right? What you expect from yourself and what the team expects from you? You all on the same page or are there... I love the expressions on your face right now, especially yours. You're yawning. You're ready to go home. All right. So just think about that for a minute. Now, back in 1990, I put my slides in the wrong order, stupid me. Back in 1990, this book was published. Zeithaml, Parasuraman and Berry, right, who had been doing academic work on service quality throughout the 1980s, and they published this book. So we are still in 1990. And this talk is like, what were people thinking about in terms of service and quality throughout the 90s, into the 2000s, and even still in some parts of the world? To a large degree, it was usurped by NPS. But as you heard, NPS is spurious bullshit. So is there something in the model that came before it that's worth looking back to and seeing if we can kind of figure out, you know, a better model for ourselves today, right? So that's kind of my proposition. So what is RATER? RATER was a model that was published in, if I just go back, in that book, right? So RATE is a great little 5-letter acronym, R-A-T-E-R, it's easy to say and so on. What happened is these guys did academic research and they were looking into what are the things that people really value in terms of service quality and service, right? So the first iteration of it came out in 1985 in an academic article. It was called ServQual, right? It has something to do with service and quality. And they identified 10 attributes. So you know how academic work happens, right? There's this whole like, what did you do? And there's this wide ranging, it's like the design thinking diamond. You go out wide and you discover a whole bunch of stuff. And then eventually you start rendering and sorting and filtering and doing this association mapping and stuff. And they brought it down to these 10 categories and there they are, right? Let's just take a moment and look at them. I'm so happy that courtesy is there. You would think credibility would have stuck around. In 88, they iterated, right? So I don't really know the reasons why. They just synthesized that list of 10 into 5. I would hypothesize being able to say the RATER framework sounded cooler than the ServQual framework, right? But essentially, they just wrapped it up into 5 headings, right? So these are 5, they're not attributes, even though in this slide deck I keep saying attributes. They're more vectors, right? So they're more territories. Right, these are 5 territories that people value, right, when they're experiencing a service from some agency. You know what I mean? Right, cool. So you've had enough time to soak up that page. RATER, reliability, assurance, tangibles, empathy, and responsiveness. So there's a bit of a definition, a simple high-level definition. Again, I'm not going to read it to you. I'll just like, does anyone here need me to read it to them? Just take a moment, soak it in. I'll have a beer. So be reliable, that sounds pretty straightforward. Assurance feels very much to me around that word trust and confidence, right? I am assured by you being present and delivering your service. You have some reputation or aura about you that makes me feel good about working with you. The tangible, I can feel it, I can touch it. Is anyone here not in the software business? This talk is for you, right? Everyone else, you're bystanders. No, just kidding. But many of us work in software and And a lot of that feels like it's intangibles. And so what have we done over the last 20 years to try to make that more tangible, right? Short cycles, put the product in customers' hands, iterate, 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 right? So it's congruent with our industry's beliefs. Empathy seems pretty straightforward. And responsiveness, how quickly do you respond to questions? How quickly do you attend to things? Remember that time when you're in a restaurant or a cafe and you really wanted the staff to come and pay attention to you and they didn't? Right? What did that do to your sentiment towards that place? Right? So this is what rate is about, right? So going, all right, so there's a million things you can ask and you can do, or there's one thing, NPS, that you can ask and you can do. But really, if we want to sense what quality feels like in a service arrangement, what we need is some guidelines. What we need is a framework to help us think, right? Frameworks are great. They're a structure for us to fit ourselves into. They're a lens for us to look at a situation in, right? They're not the end. They're not everything, but they're useful, especially if you're a beginner in a territory, right? So this is Rater. You dig into it and you find that the authors, this is the 1988 content, right? The authors will then go, right, cool. To get that RATER 5 dimensions of thing, we have to ask 50, 60 questions, right? And their details. Once again, I'll let you just look at that for a minute. But I wouldn't, this slide deck, I'll put it online and, on the Meetup, I'll post a link to it tomorrow. But the guts of it is just stuff, right? Really, I want to talk about the high level at the moment, right? What does it mean? Why is this framework interesting? What can we do with it? So how they get to all these detailed questions is they just did this iteration. Again, it's this sense making. They go out and try a bunch of stuff, see what correlates. There's a whole bunch of statistical work. This is all done in the 80s, and it's done across multiple industries. They did it in, I think I mentioned pharmaceutical and real estate. They were two of the industries, right? But it was also in education, it was in software, it was in a bunch of other things as well, right? So there's another aspect to it. It's not just the questions you ask. The experience of quality is also about the expectations versus the experience that you've had. And these authors actually did an interesting thing. They said it's not just the experience you had, it's actually the perception of the experience that you had, right? So even though that train turned up on time, you'd been standing on the platform for 12 minutes and you felt like it was late, right? And we all have versions of that we're aware of, right? So another interesting one is noise. The Western Tunnel, I live near where the construction work for the Western Tunnel is going on, and we rang them and said, man, you're keeping us and all our neighbours up all night long. What are you doing? Because they've got this thing that just goes whack, whack, whack. And it does that from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. every night, right? And they said it stays under 70 decibels. We're like, well, that's cool, but I'm in my bedroom and at 68 decibels, I'm hearing... Every now and again, it changes its rhythm. So you can actually fall asleep to this. But then when it does this, or this, it just wrecks you, right? So perception is actually more relevant than the actual experience, right? It's how we perceive the world because we're very subjective creatures. So we got that going on. So there's a whole bunch of attributes that matter. There's details within those attributes. And then there's this perception versus experience, right? This expectation versus experience thing that we have, right? So they're all the things that are bundled into this Rater model. This little diagram, I don't expect you to read the details of it, but it comes out of some of the later work that came off the back of this. And it's like, well, where do gaps in expectations happen? So I asked you a question a few minutes ago, and it's like, in that value chain that you live in, right, where are the gaps in delivery and expectation, right? Raise your hand if you think that there's absolute alignment and clarity all the way through the process. Right, so there's gaps, so there's a service quality issue going on, right? I started this conversation without qualifying something that I think I should have said, which is, we're in the business generally of building software products. We typically bias ourselves to thinking that the quality of the product is what matters the most, right? But if any of you work in agencies or in IT departments or anything that's like remote from the core of the business that you work in, there's this service experience perception, right? Now, how many of you guys have worked in organisations, I don't expect hands, but just give me that like subtle little nod or wink or whatever. How many of you guys have worked in organisations where you can tell that the senior management of the organisation would love to get rid of you because you're a pain in the ass and you're high maintenance people, right? 3 of you, well done. The rest of you are brilliant, right? No, that was actually 80% of the room gave a little nod, so cool. Right, so there's this service experience, right? And even though we might be a part of the one company, we're part of different tribes and we're part of different networks, and there's always this perception experience thing going on, right? So it's valuable to us to think about what matters to people, right? So then we go to RATER: reliability, assurance, tangibles, empathy. We don't really believe that one, do we? Oh, I thought I'd get a bigger laugh at that moment. And responsiveness, thanks. I was stalling because I forgot the last one. So cool. So there's this great opportunity to reach back in time to 1990 and to grab some techniques and tools that might be relevant today, right? But, right? Just like NPS is mystical bullshit, so is RATER, right? All models are, right? All models are what?
Bullshit.
Mystical bullshit. Wrong, right? So there was a guy, Fred Box, 1950s, famous quote: all models are wrong, some models are
useful.
Yeah, that's right, useful. So, and Daniel and I were talking earlier, like another way of thinking about this is a model is a lens, right? If you're looking at a problem, would you look at it through one perspective or would you look at it from multiple perspectives, right? So NPS is a lens, RATER is a lens. RATER is a lens with kind of 5 subsets in it, so you can kind of think of it like that, right? The problem you get whenever you go deep into an area and become an expert is you see there's 36,000 versions of the truth, right? And you have to be an expert in all of them, right? I saw that picture today of like things you need to know as a software developer, and there's like, about 128 boxes. Have any of you seen that? Yeah, you know the one. So it's that, right? The more we become experts, the more we become enamored of the detail. But most of us don't need to know that expertise. Most of us don't need to know that level of detail. What we need to know is just some fundamental basics that help us navigate into the future, right? So RATER, simple, 5 things, not one. Mind you, the 2 of them together might even be better. I don't know, I haven't thought about that. So what I want to do is tell you a couple of flaws in the RATER model, and I'm just going to rip through these fairly quickly to just make you go, I'm a skeptic of that thing, because you should never trust anything, except for me, right? Cool. So the first one is, I love this one. This is my favourite. This is why I put it up first. RATER is a disconfirmation model. Are you glad you know that? Because it tells you what people don't like. It doesn't tell you what people do like. Right? And so what if you deliver 4 or 5 things that people are kind of mostly disappointed with, but at the same time, you deliver one thing that they absolutely passionately love? Your RATER scores, just like your NPS scores, are going to be shithouse. But they're going to come back and they're going to buy and they're going to buy and they're going to buy because they love that one thing, right? So there's that. Another dysfunction of the model is you've got to ask yourself, do people really measure quality based on the gap between experience and expectation, right? Do you? When you walk into a bar or a cafe, do you walk in going, I expect this level of service, you're conscious about it? Or do you just walk in and go, I want a beer, right? What do you do?
Well, I want a beer and a whiskey.
He wants a beer and a whiskey and he wants good service while he's at it. So I remember in the 90s doing projects, and one of the projects was called UPod, right? It was at Optus, another famous telco who is well reputed for its service quality. And at this company in the 1990s, we ran a program of work called Under Promise and Over Deliver, right? And part of the work in that program was like, how low can you set expectations with a customer before they'll stop buying services from you, right?
That's one way to do it.
Sorry?
That's one way to do it.
Yeah, well, it was. It was like, how low can you go? And it was like a conscious thought. And I worked at Telstra at a different time, and I've got friends that have worked at Voda. And in oligopolies, where there's, I'm not saying this is what the telcos do, but I'm saying generally in oligopolies, there's this thing that goes on where the 3 or 4 major players in the organisation go, we're not going to compete with each other. Oh, banking, independent commissions. This is actually public knowledge now, right? 3 or 4 major players in an industry go, how shit can we actually be and still make a ton of money, right? And they do. They collude and they have these, and it happens in all sorts of ways, secret meetings, but also staff just changing from one company to another. It's all sorts of things. So how low can you go before you lose customers, and then just do a little bit better, right? Is that what we really want? Right. Anyway, let's move on. So another reason why the rater model might not be great, right? So again, Daniel talked about NPS doesn't predict the future, and I don't think rater does as well, because we might ask ourselves, how are you feeling about reliability, assurance, tangibles, empathy, and whatever that last one was today? But in 6 months' time, the industry has changed, and how fast is the industry you're in changing? And there's our friend Kano. I bet Kano comes up in this meetup about once every year. Right? People shift their expectations and tolerances for things over time. So you can't rely on past performance to judge future performance. Another one is, are those 5 rater categories, reliability, assurance, tangibles, empathy, and responsiveness, I did know the last one, do they stand up across different industries, right? So then after the authors of that book put their stuff together and put it out in the world, people do further research. And so, am I going for time, Rick? You keep looking at your watch. Right, so I'm almost finished, so it's all good. So people did further studies and they go, all right, and I haven't off the top of my head got what's going on in the industries, but here's a stat, right? So in one industry, 9 factors account for 71% of variance in the score, right? In another industry, 1 factor accounts for 63%. So that means, the contribution of those 5 rater domains in, say, real estate versus in restaurants is different, right? It's different in social work than it is in software development, right? So there's different tolerances and different priorities and different weightings in those things based on industry. Another one is same goes for countries or cultures. Right? So we, as Australians, we've got a particular view on the world and what matters and what doesn't. Americans are different, right? Americans are weird. We all know that. They prioritise things we don't understand, like orange, right? Shit joke, but let's move on. But I work a lot with Indians and with Chinese people and Americans and Germans, and it's really funny. Like I travel around the world sometimes and I do these talks on Australia culture, and you never go, what's weird about your culture? You go, you know what's strange about Australians, right? And then you lay that stuff out and then they all laugh and it's all cool. But there's another weakness in the model, right? So it's not geographically or culturally universal either. And then there's another thing. This is research that came out later than the ServQual thing, but it's the concept of moments of truth. Have any of you guys come across this? UX designers in the room are probably nodding along. Right? So not every step in the journey matters as much as every other step, right? So again, it's like, that kind of, that 5-star rater thing, you don't have to be great at everything along the way, but there's certain points where shit really matters and you got to get it together for those key moments, right? So there's another aspect to thinking about quality, right? So maybe rater is too simplistic again, right? But again, you don't want to devolve yourself into 25,000 levels of detail. Right? Another one. Is a gap on one attribute versus a gap of 3 on another attribute different, equal? What's more important, right? So in this scenario, it's empathy, right? So we've got a gap of 1 on assurance, we've got a gap of 3 on empathy. Where should we spend our time? What should we do there, right? Will one affect the other? That's another question. I haven't put that in the challenges, but do these models are they integrated and how integrated are they? And if you change one thing, does it naturally change another? And then similarly, right, you got a gap of 1 positive and 1 negative, right? Which one do you act on? Which is more important? What do you need to do, right? So they're signals, they're not answers. Yeah? Signals. you know, when we walk into an experience, I kind of mentioned that when you walk into a bar, what do you expect? Not everyone has expectations, and so that expectation experience gap may not exist because you never had an expectation, but you still had a shit experience or a good one, right? And lastly, this is a kind of a summing up to what I think are three key things to think about the rater model. So have I done a good job of setting you up and then tearing you down? Right? And you're going, well, what's the point of this, right? So reliability, assurance, tangibles, empathy, and responsiveness are still things that you should think about because it's a skeleton, it's a framework. They're categories, they're vectors, they're territories. Yeah? Right? When you think about the service you deliver upstream or downstream or whatever in that value chain you live in, right? Usually you just go, well, what are they thinking about? And it's kind of simplistic and it's like, you know, do I get them? Do they get me? But now you can go a bit more granular. Now you can be a bit more sophisticated, right? Now you can, it's the unknown unknowns are being surfaced by having categories like this to think about, right? Because you're just focused on the things you know. Now you can think a bit more broadly. But I ask these questions. Do the 5 rated dimensions incorporate the full range of service quality? Have things changed from the 80s? And so in software development, you know, it used to be like 2 years before you get a result and a lot of intangible space in between. But now it's like, you know, a couple of weeks, right? It's all cool. So we mitigate some of those risks. What about other industries? What about call centers? What about doctors? What about all sorts of other things, right? You know, has things changed since the 80s? The second one is, do consumers incorporate the outcome in context or in relation to the experience? So we're in the business of creating software products and there's a bumpy, lumpy journey on the way. Some things go right, some things go wrong, some expectations are managed well, some are not. But either way, we do stuff and at the end of it, we got paid, product went out the door, customers started buying it, right? When they come back and they go, we need to do some more software product development. Should we do that thing again or should we do something different? What do they usually do? They do the thing that they did before, right? So does that bumpy journey really change people's attitude to what they're going to do in the future? I don't know, right? I think you need to just kind of hold this idea and say there's use in it, but be tentative about it at the same time. And the last one here is, does the expectation model really stack up? Right? So again, I talk about software development, you know, short cycles and all that sort of stuff. It changes the game, right? It reduces the risk of that uncertain period and it changes people's orientation and emotional stance towards the gaps between moments, right? So again, I kind of loops back to that moment of truth idea. Where are the moments of truth? So there are a couple of challenges wrapped up for me into 3 key questions. And then there's some meta questions which my neighbour at my co-working space delivered to me 10 minutes before we walked down here, which were, do models become self-serving? So if you were to implement a rater framework in your workplace, what dysfunctions would it create? What positive attributes, what behaviours would it encourage? And what gamification is likely, or watch for gamification, and when you see it, like, you know, work on addressing it. So there's some also, so there's some other thoughts as well. So there's this great article from, I think it's early 2000s, 2004 or 5 or something, and it looks back and it goes, it's where I got a bunch of these challenges, but also it looks back at this model and acknowledges its contribution to the service industry and quality thinking, but it also says it's not perfect, but then it also says, on the other hand, it's kind of useful. Right? And I think that's where I land on it as well. And so when I work with a service organisation and I turn to my team members, and my team members bring in people like Mr. Gina here, who will say, service and quality and the emotional experience you have working with us is as important as the product, right? Do you say that? All the time. Yeah, he doesn't say that, but yeah, it's implicit in his behaviours, right? But then we have other people who might be 22 years old, software engineer, and they think, you know, good quality code is like actually going to be the answer to all the things, right? Is anyone here 22 years old and thinks good quality code is the answer to all the things? Because we have jobs. Right. So, you know, it's back to Fred Box, right? It's a model and it's potentially useful, right? So understand it, know what it can do, and then hold it skeptically, but make use of it, right? And I personally would turn more to this as a tool for introspection and maybe retrospective conversations. And maybe when you're talking up and downstream in the value chain, thinking about those topics and asking questions in that territory. I wouldn't necessarily survey people with these questions. I might, because I'm weird, but generally I wouldn't. And I certainly wouldn't pump this out to people multiple times, right? It would be more of a sense-making because I don't know where I am kind of activity. But I think it's useful, right? And I think it's good to know about. And I think in complement with Net Promoter Score, it's nice to have other models, right? So Net Promoter Score has been transformative in some industries. It's got flaws. It's got uses. It's very popular. But this was also popular for about 20 years, right? And it's still in place in many organisations as not necessarily a named thing because it kind of emerged too early for the consultants to capitalise on it, but it's there as a belief system in call centres and service organisations, right? What can we take from it? What can we steal? And what can we make our own, right? So going back to that model when you thought up and downstream and you thought about all the things, right? Reliability, assurance, tangibles, empathy, and responsiveness, right? Think about that. I'm just going to be quiet for a minute. I want you to think back to what you thought about before, right? Remember that incongruent part of that process. And I want you to think, if I break it down to reliables, assurance, trust, tangibles, empathy, and responsiveness, which one of those parts is the biggest gap? Cool. And maybe that gives you an example of how this 5-pronged model can help you be more granular, but sufficiently simple to try to improve. Yeah? That's it. I'm done.
Get back!